This lecture is focused on community ecology. Community Ecology Lecture was created, written, and taught by Nadia, Brian, Stephen, Kylene, and Ella for the School of Environment and Natural Resources at The Ohio State University, with support provided by the U.S. National Science Foundation. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to define community ecology and recognize species that affect community structure, describe possible relationships and interactions between species within a community, conceptualize how energy and matter flow through, support, and are transferred within a community, and identify defining characteristics of community structure and dynamics. Objective 1. Define community ecology and recognize species that affect community structure. What is a community? You're probably familiar with the term when it comes to humans and the communities such as neighborhoods, towns, and cities that we live in. The definition of community that we use for ecology is similar. In ecology, a community is a group of two or more populations of species living and interacting with one another in the same geological space. A community can consist of plants, animals, bacteria, viruses, and all forms of living organisms that occupy the environment. Community ecologists are scientists that study communities. There are a lot of complex interactions for these scientists to study and discover how communities function on Earth. Community ecologists examine how communities are structured, what species live within a community, what is the biodiversity like, is it thriving or in decline, and why. The interactions of species within the communities, for example, predator-prey interactions. The hierarchy of life shows the structure of a biome on Earth. It starts with an individual organism, shown as an individual elephant here, and transitions to higher and higher orders of complexity as we move from individual to population, to community, to ecosystem, and finally to biome. An individual organism is a biotic component and can be broken down further to show its individual biotic parts. For example, molecules, cells, tissue, organs. On this slide, biotic factors are shown in blue and abiotic factors are shown in orange. A biome is situated at the top of the hierarchy of life and is composed of ecosystems that occupy a geographically large area. Biomes consist of both abiotic and biotic factors and communities of flora and fauna. Biomes are defined by temperature, precipitation, elevation, location, latitude, vegetation, and animals that live within the habitat. Earth has three broad types of biomes: terrestrial, freshwater, and marine. By understanding how individual systems operate within these different levels of hierarchy, we can understand how life functions as part of the larger natural system on our planet, how life evolved on Earth, and perhaps how life evolved on other planets. Every species within a community occupies its own unique place called a niche. A niche is the position that an individual species occupies or the role that a species plays within its community. This includes how it gets its energy and nutrients, how it survives, how it reproduces, what its habitat is composed of. A niche also includes how an organism interacts with other living species. We call these biotic components, and how it interacts with the surrounding abiotic components, things like water, air, minerals, sunlight. On this slide, we see a shark. This is a fish that is a top predator in the food chain. The niche that this shark occupies is going to be very different than the other fish species that live within this community. The shark is a predator, and the smaller fish are its prey. The shark consumes a wide variety of fish species to obtain energy to survive and reproduce. This shark and the fish it eats will occupy different parts of the water column as a survival strategy. For example, maybe this shark lives most of the time near the water surface looking for prey, whereas the prey fish spends most of their lives hiding at depth to avoid the shark. We can divide organisms into two groups when we are distinguishing how they utilize a niche. Niche specialists are species that require very specific habitats or resources in order to survive. These requirements restrict where they are able to live, such as the case with this fire salamander. They live in the understories of damp forests and require ground coverings such as moss, logs, or rocks to hide under. They also must have access to clean, fresh water for their babies to grow and survive. You'll probably recognize the niche generalist shown here. It's a raccoon. Raccoons can be found almost anywhere in the United States and are not picky about their environment. They can survive in adverse conditions and utilize a variety of resources. You'll find raccoons living in cities and forests, in dry landscapes, and in swamps. Niche specialists have evolved on Earth to live in a very specific habitat and therefore do not adapt well to changing climates, whereas niche generalists have evolved differently and can adapt to changing climates quite well. Because of this, we know that significant climate events like global warming pose a much greater risk to niche specialists. Specialists are the species that scientists are most concerned with when considering extinction due to climate change. Keystone species are species that impact the community more than their mere abundance would predict. Keystone species significantly impact the overall ecosystem structure and health and can alter it in dramatic ways. They often do this by providing a unique service to the ecosystem. If a keystone species is removed from the community or if its numbers are in decline, this has a profound negative impact on the ecosystem as a whole, and other species within the ecosystem suffer. Removing a keystone species has a ripple effect on the other biotic organisms within the community, and it even impacts abiotic non-living factors within the ecosystem as well. An example of a keystone species is a sea otter. Sea otters live near shorelines and feed on sea urchins on the sea floor. This keeps the sea urchin populations in check. Without sea otters, the sea urchin population would explode and feed unchecked on kelp forests. This is bad news for the kelp as well as the other species within the ecosystem that rely on the kelp for food and shelter. Other examples of keystone species include beavers, bees, grizzly bears, wolves, alligators, orcas, lions, and wild dogs. Keystone species can typically be recognized in three categories: predators, ecosystem engineers, mutualists. Predators help control the populations of prey species, which helps maintain the health of the entire food web within an ecosystem. If there are too many deer, for example, within a forest, they will eat all the vegetation, and this will lead to the starvation of deer and other herbivores. Predators like wolves feed on the deer and keep the deer population in check so that the forest can maintain healthy growth and thereby support all sorts of wildlife sustainably for long periods of time, for example, centuries to millennia. Ecosystem engineers are organisms that create or modify habitats. The beaver is an iconic example of an ecosystem engineer. Beavers cut down trees with their teeth and powerful jaws and use the logs to create dams. This provides space for younger trees to grow. The new dam redirects the water flow and leads to the formation of ponds and wetlands that attract wildlife such as lilies, frogs, fish, birds, and raccoons. Mutualists interact between two or more species to the benefit of both species involved. For example, bees feed on the sugary nectar of flowers and in doing so help the flowers reproduce by spreading pollen from flower to fertilize the species. Ecologists recognize other categories of keystone species too, more than the three mentioned here. With all keystone species, it is most important to note that these organisms are vital to the ecosystems and its biodiversity. They serve to anchor their communities in place, and in doing so, provide ideal habitats for many other species to thrive. A foundation species is an organism that has a strong role in structuring a community by creating and maintaining the habitat. Foundation species are typically abundant in number and make up a large portion of the biomass in an ecosystem. They also have numerous connections to other species within the community. An example of a foundation species is kelp, which is a large brown sea algae that live in the ocean and are anchored to the seafloor. Kelp are photosynthetic organisms that can grow very fast. Some species can grow up to 2 feet per day. Giant kelp forests provide shelter and food for large numbers of marine species. Invasive species are those that are introduced to an ecosystem, often by humans on accident or on purpose. They are not native and they typically cause harm to an ecosystem. Invasive species cause damage to an ecosystem and to native species because invasive species typically grow very quickly and reproduce in great numbers, taking over an ecosystem. Invasive species are niche generalists, so they tolerate and survive in a wide range of environmental conditions and on a wide range of food sources. An example of an invasive species shown here is the zebra mussel, found in the Great Lakes of the United States and Canada. These mussels are native to the Caspian Sea and Black Sea, but were likely transported to the Great Lakes in ballast water of ships. Zebra mussels can cause damage to boats, docks, and intake pipes, as well as accumulate on surfaces. They can also attach to native mussels, killing them. Zebra mussels have the ability to outcompete native mussel species and overwhelm the water system, causing a shift in the local food web. Indicator species are organisms that are particularly vulnerable to ecosystem perturbations. By monitoring the health and population size of indicator species, we can determine how healthy an ecosystem is. They serve as sentinel species that detect risks to an ecosystem, acting as an early warning system for problems that may arise, such as pollution and disease. Indicator species act as signal of both healthy and unhealthy environments, and there are many threats that an indicator species can detect. When ecologists evaluate the restoration efforts of an ecosystem or evaluate an ecosystem's overall health, they often study the indicator species to determine the health status of the system as a whole. Here is a photograph of a wood stork that serves as an indicator species for the Florida Everglades in the United States. Wood storks rely on the Everglades marsh habitats to thrive. Habitat loss and drought caused these populations to be endangered in the USA from the 1960s to 2000s. Conservation efforts over the past 20 years have shown positive signs of recovery of wood storks living in the Everglades.
Lecture Objective 2. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to describe possible relationships and interactions between different species within a community. Communities are made up of many different species that interact with one another in various ways. For example, a predator such as a wolf and its prey like an elk. We can better understand communities by examining how species interact with one another and by understanding the resulting effects that take place within each species population. Changes within one species can result in cascading effects on many other populations. We can describe and define these interactions based on positive, neutral, or negative effects that they have on the species involved. To understand the interactions between species, we must first define some terms. First is symbiosis, which is a close biological or ecological relationship between two species. These are typically long-term biological interactions that are constantly in motion between two species. There are three types of symbiotic relationships: mutualism, commensalism, or parasitism. Let's now look at these symbiotic relationships more closely. Mutualism is a symbiotic interaction between two species where both species benefit. A classic example of mutualism is bees and the flowers that they pollinate. Bees benefit by eating the nectar and pollen from the flowers, and the flowering plants benefit as they are fertilized by the bees that fly from flower to flower. Other examples include humans and the bacteria that live in our digestive tracts, and oxpecker birds and zebras or rhinos. Commensalism is a symbiotic relationship between individuals of two species in which one benefits, but the other species is unaffected. It neither benefits nor is harmed. An example of commensalism can be seen between monarch butterflies and milkweed plants. Adult monarchs lay their eggs on milkweed plants, and their caterpillars, or larvae, feed on the milkweed. The milkweed plants contain a chemical toxin called cardiac glycosides that the monarch larvae ingest when they feed and store in their bodies. Cardiac glycosides are extremely poisonous to vertebrates that would eat the monarchs, but monarchs evolved a resistance to this toxin and are not harmed. Monarchs extract and store this toxin throughout their bodies during their entire lifespan. This chemical benefits the monarch butterfly by preventing predators from eating the insect, but it does not impact the milkweed plant. The last form of symbiosis that we will look at is parasitism. This is a relationship between individuals of two species in which one species benefits and the other species is harmed. There are many different strategies that parasites can use to live off of another species. Earth has ectoparasites, such as ticks or fleas, that attach to their hosts, like pets or humans, and live on the surface of their host. Conversely, Earth has endoparasites, such as bacteria or viruses, that live inside their host and often rely on a vector or a carrier organism to carry them from host to host. The female mosquito shown here in this photograph is an example of a vector. The mosquito can vector or carry Plasmodium parasites from host to host. Plasmodium causes the disease malaria in humans. Another example of parasitism is observed in brood parasites, which is practiced by some bird species, such as cowbirds and cuckoos. These birds do not build their own nests, but rather the females will lay their eggs in the nests of other bird species so that these other bird species will raise the cowbird's young as their own. Cowbirds may also remove other eggs from the nest of these species and replace them with their own eggs. The next type of community interaction that we're going to discuss is predation. Predation in basic terms is the relationship between individuals of two species in which one organism, the predator, kills and consumes the other species, the prey. There are many variations of predation and species that play predator and prey. We traditionally think of the large carnivores as being the predators and consuming smaller animals as their prey. However, we can also recognize herbivory, which is the consumption of plants by animals through grazing or browsing. Both predators and prey have evolved ways to survive. Predators evolved to become better hunters, and prey species evolved to have better defenses. Predation defense mechanisms can take many forms and can be classified as mechanical, chemical, physical, and behavioral. Mechanical defenses are things like trees with thorns, the hard exterior shells of turtles, or the quills of a porcupine. Chemical defenses are released by prey species when threatened to prevent attacks by predators. The chemical molecules are toxins or repellents that are released from spines, teeth, glands, and pores in the skin in order to poison or ward off a predator. Species can use their physical appearance to avoid predators. So prey species can use coloration and patterns to avoid predators. For example, the use of camouflage to avoid detection. Other species like zebra clustered together to use their striped patterns to confuse predators like lions, to make it challenging to determine where one species ends and another begins. Finally, some species mimic or copy another species' coloration. So if you look at the two butterflies shown here, one is a monarch that is poisonous, but the other is called a viceroy, and these are not. Viceroys do not have the same toxic chemicals that monarchs secrete. However, the viceroys mimic monarchs by having very similar coloration and wing patterns. So predators know that monarchs are poisonous and assume that viceroys are as well, and so they avoid both butterflies. Many insect species use mimicry to trick predators to not be eaten. Another type of relationship that is displayed between species and communities is called competition. Competition is a relationship between individuals of two species in which both species are harmed as they attempt to utilize the same resources. This resource is often in limited supply. For example, grass growing on a steep mountainside eaten by both mountain goats and bighorn sheep. Competition can be direct or indirect. An example of direct competition would be two different species of birds, a kingfisher and a heron, both predators, competing for fish, the prey, that live in a lake. An example of indirect competition would be between two big cats that hunt for the same prey animal, but they hunt at different times of the day. Leopards are big cats that hunt for deer at night, and cheetahs are big cats that hunt for deer during the day. Competition occurs between all species, microorganisms, parasites, insects, plants, and animals. Different species of plants compete for temperature, light, humidity, and space to grow and reproduce. Animal species compete for water, food, shelter, mates, and territories. When it comes to competition, the less fit individual will lose in terms of survival and reproduction to the species that is more fit and better adapted to the environment.
The competitive exclusion principle states that two species are unable to coexist within the same exact ecological niche. So, different species may not coexist within a community if they are competing for the same resources. It is important to understand that competition is bad, in terms of survival and reproduction, for both competitors. Even though one species will eventually be victorious, both species have exerted a great deal of force and effort and energy fighting for the limited resource or territory. This principle holds true because if there is competition between two species, for example parrots and toucans, for a shared resource, such as fig trees, within a community, then natural selection will select for the traits that lessen the species' reliance on the shared resource. In this example, the bird species, the parrot or the toucan, that is less reliant on fig trees for food and shelter will survive and win the competition. If the species with the less than desirable traits is unable to evolve behaviorally or physically, then it will ultimately be driven to extinction, or it will be forced to find a new community that can occupy where there is less competition for fig trees. The images here show an experimental study with two protozoan species, Paramecium aurulea and Paramecium caudium. The protozoa are grown individually in a laboratory. In graphs A and B, the protozoa are grown separately from one another, and you can see that they are both thriving and increasing in population size. So the protozoa cells are living at day 15, and more of them are there compared to when living in day 2. However, when these two species are mixed together and placed in the same beaker to grow together, P. aurulea outcompetes P. caudidum for food, which leads to P. caudidum going extinct in the beaker, while P. aurulea population increases and thrives.
Contrary to competition, some neighbors within a community find ways to practice resource partitioning. Resource partitioning is a strategy in which different species use different parts or aspects of a resource that is limited rather than try to compete directly for that same resource. To partition resources, communities allocate resources to reduce competition. In doing so, more species are able to coexist with one another within the ecosystem. This increases the ability of the entire ecosystem to capture energy and matter, thus benefiting all the species living within the ecosystem. A known example of this are the anole lizards that are found in Puerto Rico. This group of lizards contains many different species that inhabit similar niches and communities. For each species to survive on the limited amount of food and energy available, they must make use of the different resources within a community. Natural selection has produced different species that excel in different niches. with each species having its own preferred habitat. This unique habitat is defined by different vegetation, such as trees or shrubs, different plant heights, so tall trees, short trees, amounts of sunlight, moisture levels, and other abiotic and biotic factors. Based on these factors, each lizard species consumes slightly different food sources and thus occupies different niches within the ecosystem. In doing so, the lizard species avoid competing with one another. This increases the biodiversity of the ecosystem by increasing the survival and growth of each species within the ecosystem.
Here we can summarize the relationships that we just discussed. We have species A and species B at the top. Mutualism is the positive benefits of both species. Commensalism is the benefit of one species and no effect on the other. Parasitism is the benefit of one species and the harm of the other. Neutralism is the relationship between two species that shows no effect on either species. Amensalism is when one species infects harm on another species without any benefit or harm to itself. An example of this would be a taller and wider tree capturing sunlight and shading out a smaller tree. And the final species relationship is competition, which causes harm to both species A and species B because both species are exerting extra energy and effort to outcompete the other.
At the conclusion of this lecture, you should be able to conceptualize how energy and matter flow through, support, and are transferred within an ecosystem. All ecosystems share two common traits. One, energy always flows in one direction, flowing from one trophic level to the next. And two, matter or chemical components are constantly recycled and reused. Energy and matter are required by all organisms within an ecosystem to survive, thrive, and reproduce. This image shows Yosemite National Park, home to diverse communities and ecosystems with an abundance of energy and biodiversity. Elements like carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus are absolutely essential for life in Yosemite. These elements are constantly recycled and reused within the park. Energy from the sun is absolutely essential for life in Yosemite. Energy flows in one direction from the sun to photosynthetic plants, then to herbivores like deer, to carnivores like mountain lions, and finally to decomposers. Let's take a look at energy flow in an ecosystem. It is important to first understand the term thermodynamics. Thermodynamics is the study of energy transfer and energy transformation. There are two laws of thermodynamics that must be considered when we are thinking of how energy is transferred and used by organisms within an ecosystem. The first law of thermodynamics says that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transformed or transferred to a different form. The energy within a community is always constant. It is not being created and destroyed each time an organism is consumed or dies. It is simply being transferred to a new form of energy and utilized in a different way. The second law of thermodynamics says that when energy is transferred or transformed from organism to organism, part of the energy ends up being lost as heat, and therefore it cannot be used by living organisms to grow, survive, or reproduce. For example, plants use photosynthesis to convert sunlight to chemical energy in the form of glucose contained within their leaves. The leaves are eaten by a deer, and the deer is eaten by a mountain lion. The mountain lion will not receive all the energy that the plant captured from the sun. Most of the original energy from the sun will be lost as heat as it moves through the ecosystem. This heat cannot be used by organisms to grow, survive, and reproduce. The second law of thermodynamics essentially limits the total number of organisms that can live within an ecosystem. Biomass is the total amount of living organisms within a given area for a given time. Primary producers are organisms that convert sunlight into biomass by the process of photosynthesis. This energy is then transferred up the trophic levels. The efficiency of these transfers is important to understanding the behavior of the organisms in the community. Modeling this energy is done within a trophic pyramid and shows vital information regarding the ecosystem structure. An ecosystem must maintain and recycle biomass in order to thrive. The biomass depends on the connectivity of the food chain or food web. If there are weak links or threads, the biomass might decline or become unstable. A food chain is a sequence of transfers of matter and energy in the form of food from organism to organism. There are many players involved in a food chain, beginning with the primary producers. We then moved to the primary consumers and the high-level consumers. We will look at these organisms in more detail in a couple minutes. A food chain is a single pathway for the transfer of energy. It is a linear path. Here we see a trophic pyramid with 4 trophic levels. A trophic level is the position that an organism occupies in the food chain. Underneath the pyramid are decomposers, which function to recycle nutrients and matter in the ecosystem. Primary producers, the photosynthetic organisms, are placed on the first trophic level, that is at the bottom of the food pyramid, because they are the most prevalent in the community. More individual plants are needed in the ecosystem in order to support the high-level consumers, which have smaller population sizes. While a food chain shows a single linear pathway, a food web shows multiple pathways for energy and matter to travel within a community. A food web is non-linear and more complex than a food chain. It is a holistic model which shows the interconnected relationships of individuals within a community. Different types of species make up a food web, with each species depend on one another to live, survive, and reproduce. Food webs can show direct relationships between species. For example, a lion, a predator, and a deer, a prey. They can also uncover indirect relationships that exist between species. For example, a lupine wildflower and a grizzly bear. Now, let's look a bit more in depth at the key players that made up a trophic pyramid. First, we have primary producers. Primary producers lived at the bottom of a trophic pyramid and serve as the starting point of a food chain. Primary producers are typically photosynthetic organisms like plants, but can also be bacteria. They synthesize organic compounds like sugars and proteins from carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. Plants, algae, and phytoplankton are the most common types of producers. Primary producers are also known as autotrophs. These organisms use photosynthesis to capture light energy from the sun and convert it to chemical energy in the form of sugars. This chemical energy and biomass is passed up the food chain to primary consumers that eat the plants, algae, and phytoplankton. As we move up the trophic pyramid, we see groups of consumers. Consumers are organisms that must consume food in order to obtain energy. Consumers are also known as heterotrophs. They cannot produce their own food, and so they must eat another organism to obtain energy and matter. Consumers are broken up into levels of the trophic pyramid or food chain. As you travel up the pyramid, these consumers become less and less in number and require more and more energy. It starts with primary consumers that consume the producers. These organisms are herbivores. These may be organisms such as insects, rabbits, or ruminants such as cows. Secondary consumers then feed on these primary consumers. They may be herbivores, omnivores, or carnivores. The pyramid can continue to build until it reaches the top predators. This can be various stages or levels. These top predators will be carnivores and are known as apex predators. One part of the trophic pyramid that we often forget about are the decomposers and tridivores. These organisms are worms, fungi, and bacteria, and are all extremely important for recycling matter like carbon and nitrogen within an ecosystem, so that it can be reused by primary producers like plants. Decomposers absorb nutrients from dead and decomposing animal and plant remains in order to break these substances down and turn them into organic and inorganic building blocks that other organisms then use to grow. Fungi and bacteria are a common example of decomposers and are an essential part of the trophic pyramid. The tridivores work in a similar way to decomposers, although they ingest and digest dead material internally. Examples of the tridivores include earthworms, slugs, and sea cucumbers. Finally, although maybe not technically the tridivores, scavengers like vultures are also an important part of the food web, as these organisms eat large quantities of dead and decaying organic matter. Let's look at the trophic pyramid one more time. Here we can see all the energy transfer events that are taking place within an ecosystem. First, we see our sun's energy being captured by primary producers, plants, for example. Plants use photosynthesis to convert the energy contained in sunlight to chemical energy in the form of sugars. The sugar in the plant is consumed by organisms, deer, for example. Deer are consumed by mountain lions, and so forth as we move higher up in the pyramid. This is how energy flows from the sun to plants, to deer, to mountain lions. Scientists measure energy using the unit joules, which is abbreviated as the letter J. In this example, we see that the total amount of energy at the bottom of the pyramid, the trophic level labeled primary producers, is 1000 joules. Energy is passed in one direction, from one trophic level to the next, as one organism consumes another organism. For example, grass eaten by deer, eaten by mountain lion. This is the first law of thermodynamics in action. Energy isn't created or destroyed. It is only transferred to a different form. Notice that as you move up the pyramid, energy transfer is extremely inefficient. On average, only 10% of the energy in a trophic level is passed up to the next trophic level. In the example above, we can see that this is as the total energy in a trophic level goes from 1000 to 100 to 10 to 1 and finally to 0.1 joules as we move up the pyramid. This is the second law of thermodynamics in action. Most of the energy in a trophic level, about 90%, is lost as heat as it moves from one trophic level to the next. You can see this as 999, 0.9 joules of energy is lost as we move up the pyramid. This means that life on Earth isn't perfect, and organisms don't have to be perfect to live on Earth. Organisms in each trophic level only need to be about 10% efficient at extracting energy from the food they eat. 10% seems to be good enough to survive, reproduce, and grow in population on Earth. Let's summarize energy flow through a trophic pyramid using this graph. In this graph, we see each trophic level on the y-axis, from primary producer all the way up to apex predator. The most energy is contained within the primary producers, with a total of about 22,000 units. The least energy is contained with our apex predators, with a total of about 50 units. Units of energy are shown here on the x-axis in kilocalories per area per year. We can see that each trophic level has less energy available as we move up the trophic pyramid. Because there is less energy as we move up the pyramid, each trophic level can support fewer and fewer organisms. In this example, we may observe 1 billion individual grass plants as primary producers, 100,000 grasshoppers as primary consumers, 5,000 mice as secondary consumers, and only 40 hawks as tertiary apex consumers. Ecosystems always have many primary producers to support the organisms that live above them at higher and higher trophic levels. Trophic pyramids are limited in how high they can go because there is less and less energy available for life as we move up the pyramid. This is why, for example, there is not a predator bigger than a grizzly bear in Yellowstone National Park, or a predator bigger than an orca whale in Puget Sound, because there just isn't enough energy to support predators larger than a grizzly bear or larger than an orca. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that energy transfer within an ecosystem is not efficient. Large amounts of energy are lost as heat when energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next. The term for the transfer of energy from one trophic level to the next is called ecological efficiency. If we want to calculate the energy transfer efficiency between two trophic levels, we can use the formula shown here. We take energy production at the present trophic level divided by the energy production at the previous trophic level and multiply it by 100 to get percent efficiency. In the previous slide, we saw that the trophic level transfer efficiency was 50%, 9%, and 60% as we move up the trophic pyramid, based on how much energy was transferred from the previous trophic level to the next. It is important to understand how energy is transferred in communities, as each species requires a specific amount of energy to survive and thrive in the ecosystem. And if this amount of energy is not obtained, then this species may be in danger. Each level of the trophic pyramid depends on the one below it and supports the one above it.
Lecture Objective 4. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to identify defining characteristics of community structure and dynamics. Communities can be characterized by their structure and dynamics. It is important to recognize both structure and dynamics when managing communities and understanding potential effects from the management plans that are implemented. Community structure tells us which species exist in a community, how many there are, and how they all relate and interact with one another. Community structure is influenced and determined by both abiotic and biotic factors. These include the climate of the community, as different species can survive in different climatic conditions. The geography of the community, where the community is located, will dictate how many species it can support, such as a small island versus a large continent. The environmental characteristics of the community, is it very heterogeneous, or is there a lot of variation within the environment? And the interaction between the organisms, which we've already discussed in great detail. The structure of a community always changes over time, and communities must adapt to environmental and anthropogenic changes in order to survive. Community structures that have high ecological diversity are better able to survive. When more ecological diversity exists within a community, it creates the opportunity for more niches to exist and more ways for energy to be transferred. These factors increase a community's resilience and its ability to respond and recover from changes. There are a couple ways that we can compare and measure the ecological diversity within a community: species richness and species evenness. One way in which we can measure community structure is to evaluate the species richness. Species richness refers to the total number of different species in a community. This can be calculated simply by counting the number of different species in an area. Areas near the equator tend to experience the highest species richness, and locations near the North and South poles then tend to display lower species richness. The map here shows species richness of mammal species in North, Central, and South America. Notice the higher values or the darker colors are found near the equator in more tropical regions. Another measurement for community structure is species evenness. This refers to the relative abundance of each species in a community. For example, a community may have 11 gray wolves and 12 grizzly bears, and this would be considered high evenness. At lower trophic levels, for example, primary producers, species will appear in higher numbers and usually share a higher evenness. For example, 1 million willow trees, 1.1 million aspen trees, and 1.2 million cottonwood trees, all living in the same community in Yellowstone National Park. This community would have a high evenness. Low evenness indicates that only a few species dominate the community. Such communities are less able to respond to and withstand adverse conditions. These communities could face extinction. An example would be a community consisting of 1 million aspen trees and then only 12 willow trees and 22 cottonwood trees. This community would have low evenness. Let's look more closely at an example. Here we see two different communities, Community 1 and Community 2. Both have an area of 1 kilometer squared. Both Community 1 and 2 have 10 plants within them. Community 1 consists of 4 different species of plants. Community 2 consists of 2 different species of plants. Community 1 has more plant species and therefore higher richness than Community 2. In Community 1, each species of plant has 2 individuals, for a total of 10 plants in Community 1. Each species of plant makes up 20% of the total number of plants. This is a very even community. In Community 2, one species of plant has 2 individuals, and another species of plant has 8 individuals, for a total of 10 individual plants in the community. One species makes up 20% of the total, and that other species makes up 80% of the total number of plants. This is not an even community. Because ecological diversity is measured by both richness and evenness, Community 1 therefore has a higher ecological diversity than Community 2. In order to study a community, we must also be familiar with community dynamics. Community dynamics are the changes within a community structure and its composition over time. These changes in structure and composition may be caused by a disturbance to the community. For the community to remain healthy and effective, it must be able to adapt and respond to changes. A community with a stable structure is in a state of equilibrium. The way that an ecological community changes over time is known as ecological succession. This process is slow and occurs gradually over time, for example, decades in the case of a forest fire, or even millions of years after a mass extinction event. The engine that drives ecological succession is change. This change can be a disturbance, such as a forest fire seen here in these pictures, or the change can be triggered by the formation of an entirely new habitat, like a lava flow from a volcano. Ecological succession involves changes to the abiotic physical structure of an ecosystem, for example, the weathering of rocks to form soil, and changes to the species structure of a community, for example, grasses and shrubs give way to oak and maple trees. Succession is an amazing natural process that allows an ecosystem to recover from a disturbance and evolve over time. There are two types of succession that we're going to analyze. The first, primary succession, takes place when new land is formed or new rock is exposed. Primary succession occurs in new habitats that have not yet been colonized by living organisms and are not affected by any pre-existing communities in the area. An example would be the devastated landscape that resulted from a massive volcano eruption, like the one the United States experienced in 1980 at Mount St. Helens. The pyroclastic flow completely destroyed an area 23 miles long and 19 miles across. This devastated landscape became an entirely new area that had never before been exposed to life. Over the past 40-plus years, ecologists have been able to study primary succession at Mount St. Helens. We can see primary succession in this slide. We see newly exposed stone, for example, from a volcano eruption, on the left-hand side, and living organisms like lichens beginning to grow and form colonies on the barren landscape. Lichen is a pioneer plant species, and as these organisms grow on the rocks, they begin to break them down into minerals that then turn into soil for plants. As these changes occur over decades and centuries, larger plant species and animal species are then able to move into and thrive in these newly created ecosystems. Primary succession is always started by pioneer species, which are the first species to colonize a barren ecosystem. These species are typically plants and lichens, which have evolved to thrive in barren landscapes. The lichen shown here is a symbiotic organism consisting of an algae and a fungus. The algae is able to produce energy from the sun by photosynthesis, and the fungus is able to extract energy from decaying matter. This combination makes these organisms well suited to be pioneer species. Barren ecosystems are not able to support diverse communities full of different species. Pioneer species like lichen prepare the barren landscape so that other organisms can migrate in, survive, and reproduce. Lichens are able to grow on rocks or other surfaces without the need for soil. As the lichen populations grow, they weather and break down the rock into minerals, which combine with decaying matter from algae and fungi to form soil. As the soil develops over thousands of years, plant species can begin to sprout roots in this new soil and start to grow. Pioneer species tend to be photosynthetic organisms that use sunlight to produce energy for growth. This is because barren landscapes lack much organic energy, for example, sugar, which can be used for growth. Pioneer species also tend to be wind pollinated, as there may not be many pollinating insects in the area. Finally, pioneer species, for example fungi, often reproduce asexually. Secondary succession occurs when a mature ecosystem has been disturbed by an event such as a wildfire, flood, or avalanche. This type of succession typically occurs at a much quicker pace than primary succession. This is for a few reasons. One, there are already soil, organic matter, root systems, and a seed bank present in the landscape, which allows for quicker regeneration of the community. And two, the organisms that have been alive and growing in the mature ecosystem have already made the soil fertile and modified the soil so that it is prepared for regrowth and recolonization. Here we see a healthy, mature forest ecosystem, which has been disturbed by a wildfire. In panel 4, we see that the fire has eliminated all above-ground structures, from trees, shrubs, and grasses. However, the soil has protected all below-ground structures, for example, roots and organisms, for example, worms, and these remain alive and intact. This allows for a much quicker repopulation of the area. In panel 5, we see pioneer species, and then over decades to centuries of change, we see the formation of a mature ecosystem again in panel 8. Numerous events can trigger secondary succession to occur. Ecologists refer to these events as an environmental disturbance, and these events can dramatically alter an ecosystem. They can be natural, such as an earthquake and landslide, or anthropogenic, such as a wildfire caused by power lines. Other examples include fires, volcanic eruptions, introduction of an invasive species, clear-cutting forests, mountaintop removal, and climate change. Disturbance events are characterized by frequency and impact. They may occur every few years, or they may only once in a million years. The impact can also vary widely. A tornado, for example, may cause minimal damage to surrounding vegetation within a community, versus the eruption of a volcano, which could completely wipe out an ecological community. Species on Earth have evolved with and been shaped by exposure to natural disturbances. For example, insects that occur in temperate freshwater streams found in Germany have evolved so that their larvae hatch from eggs during the spring and summer seasons when their plant food is abundant. Desert insects, on the other hand, have evolved to live in deserts where freshwater streams are unpredictable and infrequent. They adapted so that their larvae only hatch from eggs when a flood event occurs, which may occur several years apart. Eventually, a community may be classified as a climax community. A climax community is one that is in the final stage of succession, in which the organisms within the community remain stable and exist in balance with the ecosystem. A climax community has reached a state of equilibrium, where plants, animals, and other species are all adapted to live, survive, and reproduce in the ecosystem. A climax community typically takes thousands to millions of years to develop. The beech tree seen here is part of a beech maple climax forest in Warren Woods of Michigan, a state park in southwest Michigan. Many communities never reach climax community status because of natural or man-made disturbances. Habitat fragmentation is the discontinuance or fragmentation of an organism's natural habitat. It can occur due to natural events, or most often it's caused by human activities. Fragmentation can have severe impacts on a community structure. Causes of fragmentation may include climate change, agriculture, and urbanization. Fragmented ecosystems can no longer function properly, which can lead to the extinction of many species. Fragmentation would be like you losing your bathroom, or kitchen, or hallway, or bedroom in your apartment or home. Your home would no longer function properly, and eventually you would have to leave and find a new home. If you couldn't find a new home, you would struggle to survive. This is similar to what happens when a natural ecosystem is fragmented. And unfortunately, most plants and animals can't find new homes, which leads to their extinction. In the image shown here, we can see how humans are fragmenting the Amazon rainforest in Brazil by cutting down or burning down the rainforest trees to build towns, roads, and create pasture land to raise cattle. As these fragmented landscapes grow, plant and animal species end up going extinct, never to be found again. If you look at Brazil on Google Earth, you can see the extensive fragmentation that now exists in places like the Amazon rainforest. Another physical characteristic that may be seen amongst communities are edge effects. These are the changes in community structure that occur at the boundary between habitats. Greater biodiversity can typically be seen in these areas of overlap, as species of both ecosystems can inhabit these areas. in addition to unique species that are adapted to the edges themselves. Edge effects are more prevalent in fragmented areas. An ecotone is a zone of transition between two ecological communities or two habitats. These areas can connect smaller zones, such as a wetland and a field, or they can be broader and connect larger ecosystems, such as an entire forest to a grassland. These boundary transitions can be very sharp and defined, or they can be more gradual and less defined. In this slide, we see examples of ecotones separating two communities, A and B. You can see that an ecotone can take many shapes, sizes, and complexities. Restoration ecology is the study of repairing damaged ecosystems by human intervention. What can be done about damaged or fragmented ecosystems? Restoration ecologists work to improve ecosystems that have been damaged due to disturbances. This work involves repopulating and reestablishing both plant and animal species within an ecosystem. Restoration actions can come in many forms, but may include revegetation, habitat enhancement, or remediation. Such efforts often take a great deal of time, money, and work in order to properly restore an ecosystem to its former structure and function. Restoration projects can take place in a variety of ecosystems. Restoration ecologists work to improve rainforests, prairies, wetlands, and many other natural areas. We often use restoration techniques to improve land that has been damaged by human development or resource extraction. Unfortunately, this reach from humans has extended to large areas of the globe and impacted millions of acres of various ecosystems. One specific type of development we see restoration in often is mines. Restoration in these areas is called mine reclamation. Steps included in restoring these areas might include leveling or evening the land, adding new topsoil or appropriate substrate, reseeding native vegetation, and monitoring the area. It is often built into contracts of mining companies that reclamation must be performed to a site after mining or resource extraction in the area is completed. Restoration to natural areas is vital in order to restore the ecosystem functions and native wildlife to the area.